My name is Will Ackerman. I'm the philanthropy coordinator for inewsource. Welcome to the first edition of our quarterly Dig This series. Thank you so much for joining us today and being a supporter of inewsource. inewsource is a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom founded in 2009 and dedicated to improving the lives of everyone in San Diego and the San Diego region through impactful, data-based, investigative, and accountability journalism. This will be a roughly 1 hour long webinar. We will try to have a Q&A portion at both the middle and the end of the webinar. And so if you'd like to field a question, please do so using the Q&A portion or the tool in your Zoom screen, which should be in the toolbar at the base there. And we will address it in order. If you're an attendee, you can actually upvote other people's questions if you want them answered. So I will be mindful of that as well. And without further ado, I'm just going to review briefly our speakers for today. We have Jamie Self, our managing editor of inewsource. She directs our editorial strategy here and manages the newsroom and our publication schedule. We have Cody Dulaney, our investigative reporter. Cody joined us in September 2019 as an investigative reporter, and he covers housing and homelessness and how those topics sometimes intersect with law enforcement. And we're very lucky to have Madeline Howard joining us today. Madeline is the senior staff attorney at the Western Center on Poverty and Law. And so with that, I'm just going to hand things over to Jamie.
So thank you, Will, for the introduction, and of course, Cody and Madeline for being here with us. And a huge thank you to our members in the audience for taking time to be with us this evening. So we are discussing Cody's reporting on illegal rent increases in the Section 8 program, which is a federal program that helps low-income people pay market rate rent. You know, in the journalism field, sometimes it takes time to have impact on an issue, but in this case, Cody's reporting has been groundbreaking. Swift policy changes followed his investigation, and there are now 30,000 families in the San Diego region who have been promised the same protections from unlawful rent increases other California renters have. So we're proud of bringing this issue to light and forcing public officials to answer tough questions on the record, and we could not have done it without your support, so thank you. I also want to mention at the top here that this issue isn't just about people who are involved in Section 8. It impacts San Diegans and Californians well beyond. It affects taxpayers who pay for these programs and are, as a result, funding these excessive rent hikes. It affects the housing market because these increases can end up inflating the market for other renters. And it affects the untold number of people who can't get Section 8 support. And in San Diego alone, the waiting list is 12 to 15 years. So on that note, let's get started. And first, we'd like to know just a little bit more about you, and this will give us a chance to test the Q&A feature, or no, I'm sorry, the poll. Yeah, okay. So Will is going to drop a poll in the poll tool, so please look out for that. We'd like to know, are you a renter, a rental property owner, or a homeowner? And this will help all of us kind of understand a little bit better what perspective you're coming from. And so while you are filling out the poll, we'll wait a moment.
Yeah, so it looks like we have one renter so far, one rental property owner, and 7 homeowners. Okay,
all right, great. So we have a little bit of a mix here. That's good. All right, great. So, no more delay. Cody, why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit about your reporting project?
Sure. And thanks again, everybody, for joining. Just as a background, public housing authorities are responsible for managing the federal Section 8 voucher program. And as Jamie said, this is one of the largest and most significant safety nets for low-income residents anywhere in the nation. Each year, these public housing agencies receive millions of dollars to help tenants pay rent, but they're supposed to ensure rent increases for voucher holders are reasonable and lawful before using taxpayer money to pay for them. My initial investigation last November revealed the San Diego Housing Commission was approving rent increases without checking if they violate state law.
You're muted, Judy.
Yeah, sorry. Little bit of technical difficulty here at the beginning. Great, Cody. So we are going to dive very deeply into Cody's reporting. But first, thank you, Madeline, again for being here. You are working on the front lines of the housing crisis every day, providing legal support to our most vulnerable neighbors for whom rent is getting just more and more expensive. Can you tell the audience in simple terms, what's your job like and why is this issue so important?
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, my job is amazing and also very, very hard. Western Center is a statewide support center, and we do everything anti-poverty, including housing, access to justice, health, public benefits, and I work on the housing team, surprise. And it's really a huge privilege. I get to work both on legislation to protect tenants from eviction and protect their rights. And then I also get to go into court and enforce the new laws that we work on. And in addition to doing impact cases that help a lot of people at the same time, I also get to support eviction defense attorneys that are really on the front lines defending individual tenants from eviction. So it's a whole broad range of things. And I work really closely with organizers as well. And I said it's hard because there's always so much to do. I think it's probably no surprise to anyone here that we are in the middle of a housing crisis in California. We have been for a long time. And it's also a homelessness crisis. We have so many folks who are living on the street. And people who are working can't afford to live. When I was preparing for this conversation, I looked at a calculator that MIT puts out that's about self-sufficiency, like how much you need to make in order to live. And in San Diego, if you have two kids, you need to work 4 minimum wage jobs to earn a living. And that's just unrealistic. No one should have to do that. So we have a crisis on our hands.
Madeline, can you dig in a little bit deeper there? How important is it to keep people, especially low-income residents, in their homes? What's the alternative for many low-income folks who are facing eviction?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point because we have so many policy discussions right now that kind of treat tenant rights and homelessness as separate issues, and they're not separate issues. When a low-income family is evicted from their home, it's not as if they just move down the street or find another apartment. Those initial costs of a security deposit and first and last month's rent, that's really out of reach for a lower income family. So when someone is rent burdened and they're paying a lot of their income towards rent and then they get a rent increase, they're going to be homeless, like right away. There's a very clear connection between tenants' rights and homelessness. And I think that's really important to sort of how we think about these issues. I do want to point just specifically, if anyone doubts what I'm saying, there's data from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, that just a $100 rent increase, it doesn't sound like that much, but that actually leads to a 9% increase in homelessness. So it's a really stark situation. And also just to highlight, in case this isn't clear, eviction is hugely harmful to individual people who are evicted, both health impacts, kids in school, it just impacts the family's entire life. So it's really important to address this and to enforce these tenant protections. As Cody was talking about, we can't have the housing authority approving these rent increases that are unlawful because it has real impacts on people's lives.
Madeline, thank you for that. That statistic is pretty startling, especially when we think about the amount of money that people are being asked every year to pay, even in the San Diego region. So thank you for that. I think it will be helpful because we are going to be getting into some pretty complicated policy and legal issues. I think it would be helpful to take a step back and just tell the audience about the Tenant Protection Act and Section 8. So why don't you start with Section 8?
Yes, I am a lawyer. I tend to use acronyms and be wonky, so sorry for that. Let me explain these programs. Okay, so first, Section 8. So first of all, it's not actually called Section 8. The name was changed to the Housing Choice Voucher Program a long time ago, and everyone just completely ignores that. Everyone still calls it Section 8. So whatever you want to call it, the voucher program, I'll go with that. This is incredibly important part of the fight to address homelessness and to help low-income people afford to live in the communities that they want to live in. And the way it works, it's not like public housing where the government sort of owns an entire building that people live in. The voucher goes to the individual tenant and they can take it's not really a piece of paper, but they can take the voucher and go and find an apartment on the private market where the rent is just as high as everyone else's rent. And then using that voucher, the housing authority will pay part of the rent and the tenant is only supposed to pay 30% of their income for rent. The formula gets pretty complicated and we don't really have time or attention for that here, but in general, it's supposed to be about a third of their rent, or excuse me, a third of their income. So this is a way of allowing people with low incomes to live in different neighborhoods and to just create more affordability for families. So it's a really important program. And I looked at the numbers for San Diego and it was really stark, and this is actually not unusual, but as of September of last year, it was 144,000 people on the wait list, which is just wild. So there's a huge demand for this program. Oh, and then you asked about the Tenant Protection Act, the TPA.
Sure, thank you.
Yes. So the Tenant Protection Act, this is a law that my organization actually co-sponsored along with our friends at Public Advocates and ACE and PICO. David Chu was the author. And it was enacted in 2019, went into effect on January 1st of 2020. And this was a huge change in the law because the folks in the audience, we heard that there's a bunch of homeowners. You might not be aware, but as a tenant, even if you've been living in your apartment for 30 years and been the model best tenant ever, without protections that are in the TPA or a local law, the landlord could just give you a notice and say, you're evicted and I'm not going to tell you why. Or they could give you like a $5,000 rent increase. There's really no sort of baseline protection. So for tenants who live in communities without a local rent control law, the Tenant Protection Act was this huge change. And what it says is that you can only be evicted for a good reason. Obviously, non-payment of rent is a good reason, creating a safety hazard, things like that. And then it also caps rent increases. And it caps rent increases annually at 10% or inflation plus 5%. So the 10% is sort of the top cap. And I think it's really important to understand that while limiting rent increases in this way is a big change and really important, this is not rent control. And it really doesn't protect tenants entirely because a low-income family who gets a 10% rent increase, that is not affordable. So we really need to do better in looking at local protections that go deeper and protect more sort of robustly from rent increases. So I'll stop there.
Madeline, thank you so much for that. That was excellent. So Cody, let's talk about your project. And, when you and I were initially talking about this, you weren't looking into Section 8 specifically. So tell us how you decided to dig into voucher housing policies and how they relate to the TPA.
Yeah, I kind of stumbled into this. It started with a tip, as many of these projects do. I got a call from a tenant who was just madder than heck about a rent increase he had received. This is a guy who had clearly done his homework. He'd called around. I think he even spoke with an attorney. And he was telling me, he's like, by God, this rent increase is illegal. And of course, immediately I was interested, started calling around to folks I know who, focus on housing law. And they said, yeah, they were seeing this left and right, and property owners were getting more and more creative about how they were trying to raise the rent on tenants. So I really wanted to take a step back, and I wanted to know how often this was happening, how many people were getting shocked by steep rent increases, and really just tried to quantify this. But I quickly learned there was almost no data available unless somebody takes this to court. And even then, those records are largely protected from public view. There's really no way to know how often this is happening. So the guy who originally called me about this, he did not have a Section 8 voucher. But I remembered housing authorities are supposed to keep detailed records. Anytime a landlord increases the rent on a Section 8 voucher holder, there should be a record of those agencies reviewing and approving it. And my thinking was Section 8 voucher holders are some of the most vulnerable tenants in any community. People who would otherwise fall into homelessness without this assistance. So I started filing records requests to obtain those documents, and from there, the project really kind of took on a life of its own.
Great, Cody. And so tell us, what did you find out, and what were you surprised about as you reported?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I continue to be surprised in my reporting on this. This story is continuing, but I think the biggest surprise for me early on was how difficult it was to get an idea of the universe or the scope of rent increases that come through the San Diego Housing Commission. And what I mean by that is landlords, as I mentioned, they have to ask permission to raise the rent on Section 8 voucher holders. And the agency receives about 10,000 of these requests each year. And each time a request comes in, there's a staff member reviewing these increases and either approving or rejecting them. And early on, there was a lot of back and forth with the Housing Commission about, what data is available, what isn't, what records are available, and, which ones are protected. And, we ended up getting our attorney involved to try and push back on some of these roadblocks and barriers that were getting thrown in our way. And it was actually our attorney who suggested, just request the raw applications that landlords have to submit and focus only on the ones that were approved. So our attorney gave us that idea. And so that's what we did. We focused on 1 week's worth of approved applications, and we figured that would give us enough of a sample size to figure out, how this is working, how they are processing these increases. And it's only a snapshot in time, but we found more than a fifth of these increases exceeded the state's 10% maximum cap. Some increases were as high as 50 and 60%. So when we saw that, we knew we were on to something here. And then right around this time, State Attorney General Rob Bonta sent a letter to every housing authority in California, and it said public housing agencies have a duty to follow state law and better scrutinize rent increase requests. Apparently, his office had been receiving complaints that agencies weren't following the law. So with these raw applications that we obtained and analyzed, and with the Attorney General's guidance, we sat down for an interview with the Housing Commission officials, and we ultimately discovered they weren't considering state law at all when reviewing these rent increases. They just didn't think it was their responsibility to apply state law to a federal program.
Thank you, Cody. So, Madeline, help us unpack this a little bit. What does this mean? Why does this matter?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I mean, as Cody was saying, Section 8 tenants are some of the most vulnerable tenants. These are really low income people, and they are especially vulnerable to getting an unfair rent increase. So this is a hugely important issue. And I also want to highlight that before that letter that the Attorney General sent out, there was guidance before that. I mean, the Housing Commission really doesn't have an excuse for ignoring this protection, because even before the Attorney General sent a letter about vouchers being covered, they already had guidance on their website for years, as did the Civil Rights Department, which is the state department in charge of enforcing civil rights laws. So everybody knows that vouchers are covered. Everyone should have known that housing authorities had a duty to refuse these rent increases. And I also want to highlight that in addition to harming the family who is subjected to the rent increase, it's kind of complicated, like how much more the family is going to pay versus the housing authority. But the family is going to be harmed, but the housing authority is also harmed, and the community is harmed, because they're paying all this money to these unlawful rent increases. And, I just said there's more than 100,000 people on the waiting list. We need all the vouchers we can get. We have folks living on the street. And so instead of having more vouchers to help more families, this money, this taxpayer money, is going to landlords who are demanding unlawful rent increases. So the housing authority really has a duty here that they were abdicating, and it's very important.
Thank you for that, Madeline. Cody, any takeaways at this point?
Yeah, just to drive home one point that Madeline talked about, San Diego officials consistently say, we need more money for the Section 8 program. And that's absolutely true to some extent. As Madeline pointed out, there are more than 100,000 people on the waiting list here in San Diego alone. We are in the middle of a worsening housing and homelessness crisis. But the key here is oversight and accountability for the limited funding they do have is crucial when it comes to getting help to those who need it most.
Great. Thank you, Cody. Okay, so now let's talk about, you published the story. What happens next?
Yeah, I'd say the response was pretty strong. The week our investigation published, a lawsuit was filed against the Housing Commission. That suit asks the judge to force the agency's compliance with state law and claw back any public money illegally paid to private landlords. San Diego City Council President Sean Elo Rivera also weighed in on this. He asked a top Housing Commission official about the investigation and said staff should work to recoup any money that should not have been paid out, either by tenants or the agency. On the other hand, Housing Commission officials denied breaking any laws and said Section 8 voucher holders were never protected under this law to begin with. Now, they are working on a local policy that would largely mirror the state's cap while offering landlords a hardship exemption, which is not something that state law allows. And they said that, this policy would have to be approved by the federal government before it could go into effect. But the Housing Commission officials there insist that, they were following legal guidance that said state law doesn't cover Section 8 and that every other housing agency in the county was doing the same exact thing.
Madeline, do you want to jump in right here? Because we were going to address this later, but this idea that the Housing Commission was referring to a legislative opinion written by, legislative attorneys right after the Tenant Protection Act was passed. Can you give us a legal perspective on the gravity of that opinion?
Yes, I would love to. So I just want to just mention one more time. So the chief law enforcement officer of the state has on their website and has sent a letter to every housing authority saying you have to comply, vouchers are covered. So it's a little hard to understand why that doesn't sort of close the door on this question. But I believe that the authority that the Housing Commission was referring to was this legislative council opinion that was issued right after AB 1482, the Tenant Protection Act, was passed. And basically that legislative council opinion, while it's on fancy letterhead, has no legal weight whatsoever. It has just the same value as if I wrote on a piece of paper what my opinion of the law is. There's a California Supreme Court case that explains this, but when a legislative council opinion is issued after a law is passed, it's just nothing special. So they never should have relied on that. That never had any authority. And then when you get to the point that the Civil Rights Department, the Attorney General, and HUD are all telling you something, I mean, it's just, there's really no justification here at all.
Great, thank you for that. Before we move on, Cody, I do want you to talk a little bit more about the things that happened after you reported on the San Diego Housing Commission. What happened around the county?
Yeah, well, the biggest change here is so we're jumping a little bit ahead. But one of the things that I realized in my reporting, and I kind of I do want to go back a little bit. In the Housing Commission's response to me, they were saying, yeah, every agency was doing the same exact thing, and that turned out not to be true. When the Housing Commission said every agency within the county was doing the same thing, I really wanted to fact check that because if that were true, that's a bigger story here. So here in San Diego County, there are 6 public housing authorities, and my reporting found that 3 of them weren't checking to see if increases complied with state law. And those were San Diego County, and Oceanside. On the other hand, officials in National City and Carlsbad, they say they've been complying with state law the entire time. In Encinitas, they say they started complying right after the Attorney General came out and said the law applies to Section 8. And I do want to touch on this point because, these conversations were really, really interesting because keep in mind, San Diego is the elephant in the room here. It's the largest housing agency in the region. 17,000 households they serve. And some of these other agencies like National City, Carlsbad, and Encinitas, they serve only a small fraction of that combined. And in some of these smaller agencies, it was almost as if staff members were personally offended that I would even suggest they weren't following state law. Like, yes, of course I'm doing the math on these increases. Like, are you kidding me? It's the law. So to get back to your question, Jamie, what happened around the county after my reporting? Well, the biggest change is that these three agencies that weren't checking the math on increases, they started checking. San Diego County announced 3 weeks after our investigation published that it would change its policy. And the day after I published that story about the change coming from the county, Oceanside officials said they would do the same thing. San Diego's local policy that I mentioned earlier is still pending, but in February, officials with the Housing Commission said they would comply with state law after receiving guidance from HUD. So HUD has weighed in, come out, said, yes, housing authorities have a duty to check this. So yeah, with those three agencies changing their policies to comply with state law, that means 30,000 households now have protections they weren't getting collectively, and nearly $500 million, that's a billion with a B, is being better managed.
Cody, thank you for that. Lori actually has a great question in the chat about landlords. And this is ground that we weren't planning to cover, but I think it is good ground to cover. She asks, are these big increases intentionally flouting the law, or do they feel they are justified as their costs increase?
That's a great question. I think in my reporting, I found a lot of the time, probably most often, landlords were just unaware. They were just going through the course of their business and they see their costs increasing, whether it's in maintenance or upkeep, general upkeep, or insurance costs, mortgage. All of these costs are increasing. And yeah, in the course of my reporting, people just were not aware of the law. And oftentimes when tenants, start asking questions, reaching out to attorneys, attorneys then have to contact these landlords and say, hey, this increase you're requesting, it violates state law. And I've seen several examples where the landlords will turn back and say, well, hey, the Housing Commission approved it, so it must be legal. So I think there is, on one hand, on the landlords, they don't quite know. They aren't aware of the law. And then when you have the Housing Commission just approving these increases, it leaves landlords with, who am I to believe here? So that was one interesting thing I found in my reporting.
Great, thanks. Madeline, do you want to jump in and add anything here, or?
Yeah, maybe I can just weigh in on the policy that's been proposed that's saying now we're going to comply with the law. And Cody kind of hinted at this, but I just want to say it a little bit more directly. As I read it, the policy that's now being proposed does have this hardship exemption, and the procedure is not really explained at all. But I just want to, maybe it's helpful to kind of think of this in a different context. Like if a police officer comes up to you when you're involved in unlawful conduct, you can't say, oh, I have a hardship, so just like, let me get out of the law. This is not how it works. So I think that it's a step in the right direction, but there is no exemption for a hardship. So that part alone makes this just a no-go. And it's also very problematic that the way this policy is being proposed, it sort of pretends it's a choice. It sort of pretends that the commission is saying, oh, we're deciding now that we're going to comply with state law. No, this has been the law for more than 4 years, and they had to comply from the beginning. And as Cody was talking about earlier, there have been all of these rent increases already that were approved that were unlawful. So harm is already being done. It's not just about going forward. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Madeline. Is there anything else you want to add about the situation around the state before we move to talk about the lawsuit here in San Diego?
Yeah, maybe just a little bit of context setting. As I've mentioned, there's sort of a series of different pieces of guidance from different law enforcement agencies about this. And just to sort of compare what's happening to San Diego and to my experience in other places, a few years ago, before we had this guidance from the Attorney General, before we had the guidance from HUD, there was some lack of clarity in a few housing authorities, but my experience in other housing authorities around the state was as soon as they received a letter from me and other legal aid organizations telling them that they were violating the law and telling them that they could not approve these rent increases, they got into line and complied. So the sort of stubbornness that we're seeing here and the failure to comply even after all this guidance is notable. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank Pete for dropping a comment in the chat. Pete says, after listening to today's oral arguments at the U.S. Supreme Court, I'm feeling less confident that a number of powers that be, local, state, regional, national, up to and including SCOTUS, are interested in following statutory or decided law. I wish my cynicism would be not so prevalent, but here I am. Thank you for shining a light on this issue. Pete, thank you so much.
Is it helpful if I try to answer the other question in the chat right now regarding the acceptance of Section 8?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So thank you, Lori, for this question about discouraging landlords from accepting Section 8 vouchers. So this is a good time to share that the same day that the Tenant Protection Act was signed, the governor was actually at the signing ceremony. The governor signed another law, SB 329, which makes it illegal to discriminate against people who are using a housing voucher. So a landlord does not get to say, I don't rent to Section 8 holders. I don't take vouchers. That is against the law. And this is a change to our statewide anti-discrimination law, which is the Fair Employment and Housing Act. So while it may be frustrating to have the amount of rent that you can charge be limited, landlords have to accept vouchers. And the Tenant Protection Act applies to most tenancies. There are exceptions, like for single family homes that are owned by individuals, but a landlord of sort of a regular multifamily building or a multi-unit building, they are also going to be subject to this protection. So hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Thank you, Madeline. So shifting to the lawsuit locally, Madeline, can you summarize the legal claim and tell us how significant is this lawsuit for efforts across the state to help renters and low-income residents afford housing?
Yeah. So just to be clear, I am not personally involved in this lawsuit. So I want to say that at the beginning. But basically, the relief that they're seeking is just asking the Housing Commission or ordering the Housing Commission to follow the law. So as Cody has been outlining, they were just approving these rent increases without regard to whether they complied with the Tenant Protection Act, and that is not legal. They need to be reviewing rent increases and rejecting a request for rent increase if it exceeds the limits in the TPA. So it's really just looking for compliance. And then the other piece here is that by sort of selecting voucher holders individually and allowing these huge rent increases only against them, they are being discriminatory. So there's kind of just like a not complying with the law, and there's also discrimination happening. So it's trying to address both of those things. And in terms of the statewide impact, I mean, really this suit should not have had to been brought in the first place. They should have just complied. So, I mean, I think just don't want to say that at the beginning, this should not be necessary. But here we are, it was. And so to the extent that other housing authorities were still having trouble complying, I think this shows that you will be held accountable if you have flout the law. So.
Madeline, thanks so much. You know, Cody and I have talked a lot during this reporting about how there's hardly any data to get a real handle on how impacted local renters are and how often they feel like they're being mistreated, but then, you know, where can they go and where can they get justice? So interested if you can talk to us a little bit about, you know, if we don't know the trends, how can we really know whether the law is working?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really hugely important issue. We really, really need to have disaggregated data where you can see like the race and the demographics of people impacted, and it needs to be in real time in order to make good policy decisions. I think the lack of data is a huge problem. We have sort of a overarching problem with no eviction data because our court records are sealed. But in this world with rent increases and not being able to track them, it's really hard for city and local government to make good decisions when they don't know what's happening on the ground. And I want to flag that in some communities, there's actually a solution to this that's been found. I'm in the Bay Area, and here in Berkeley, for example, they have a really great program where they have a lookup tool where you can just look at the lawful rent ceiling for any unit in the city. Because Berkeley has actual rent control, where rent increases are limited to sort of a fraction of the consumer price index. So it's usually like 1% or some very small amount. So you can see how much rent is being increased, and you can see the price of units. And then landlords are also required to file a document when they're going to seek to evict someone. So you can imagine that this is just incredibly helpful when you're trying to make public policy and track what's happening and people in the community. Are they getting rent increases? Are people facing eviction? It's just a really helpful tool, and otherwise you're sort of operating in the dark.
Thanks for that. Cody, can you talk a little bit more about what you're hearing from attorneys and renters? You hit on that a little bit at the top, but what do you hear from attorneys on this topic of, challenges and potential solutions?
Yeah. As I said earlier, attorneys that focus on this issue say property owners are really getting creative. Some property owners are really getting creative with all of the ways that they try to increase the amount they get from tenants each month. So that includes, new fees for water, sewer, or trash, even sudden requirements to obtain renter's insurance. Some people are receiving multiple increases in a single year. Late last year, we put together a list of red flags that tenants can keep an eye out for, to kind of help people out with that stuff. As for tenants, we also put together a survey to see what people are experiencing. And at my last check, we had nearly 60 respondents. And it's really interesting. It includes people from all walks of life, not just Section 8 voucher holders, and who've been burdened by rent increases. For example, there was a single mom who had to move back into her parents' house with her children to save money. A retiree on a fixed income struggling to make ends meet. It's interesting. I even had some property owners take an opportunity to say this kind of government overreach ties their hand. They filled out the survey just to let me know how they feel about it. So, yeah, I mean, it's a really broad spectrum of responses.
Great, thank you so much. And we've talked a little bit about solutions, and Madeline, you mentioned Berkeley. Are there other communities in California that are just really nailing this in terms of the rent control policies and in terms of the programs or systems that they have in place to give renters who have grievances a path toward getting, an answer or getting a fair assessment on their rent?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I think there's so many cities that are doing really great and innovative things, and I'll mention a couple. So Berkeley is one, Oakland, Alameda, up here in the Bay Area. And one of the items that I think is really helpful when you have this robust rent control is having an administrative body, as you mentioned, where instead of going to court when there's a dispute, you can just go into an office in City Hall and say, hey, I have this problem. Can you help me work it out? Because no one wants to go to court. The landlord and the tenant, neither of them want to. So having sort of administrative thing in the city where you can address these concerns is really helpful. And then I also want to highlight something that's sort of adjacent to this, really amazing work happening in Los Angeles on many types of tenant protections. And they recently passed an ordinance that says that you can't be evicted unless you owe at least a 1 month of fair market rent for your unit. And this is addressing this ridiculous situation where someone can lose their home that they've lived in forever because they owe, like $150. And so having sort of a minimum threshold for eviction, I think, is a really great policy tool for, creating community stability. So a lot of great stuff happening all across California.
Great. Cody, Madeline, anything else before we go to questions?
Nothing for me. I think we covered it.
Yeah, I would just quickly point out LA was actually praised by Attorney General Rob Bonta for complying with state law all along. And, it was interesting. I reached out to officials there to see what was happening and how they were processing these increases. And it's such an interesting dynamic because the city of LA already has a rent stabilization law that applies to housing, but it's housing built before 1978. And it caps increases for those properties at 4% or 6% if the landlord is responsible for utilities. So it's a much more strict law in LA. And that law covers 2/3 of all Section 8 participants. So in LA, all they have to do is just check what year the structure was built. Does this local ordinance apply? If not, then they move on to the Tenant Protection Act and see if the unit falls under that. So yeah, it was a really interesting thing. And when I talked to them, staff in LA, they were kind of taken aback about the Attorney General's praise of their work because they were like, "Hey, we thought everyone was doing this." So it was just another interesting conversation.
Cody, thanks for that. Yeah, I think with that, we will open it up to questions from the audience. More questions.
Yeah, if anybody has a question, please feel free to field that in the Q&A section now. Looks like we do have one from Lori. See, if you are doing your job, you make the reporting sound simple and easy when you write it up, but we know the reporting is really hard. Where the biggest obstacles to your reporting, and how long did it take you to get around them?
Yeah, I think it was a year from the moment that I got the tip from that one guy calling me just really angry about his rent increase. From the moment that I got that tip until publication, I think it was about a year of reporting, just really just trying to work with the Housing Commission, going back and forth with staff, filing public records requests. And of course, every time we file a request, it takes several weeks for us to get information back. So it was a series of filing requests, getting back something that didn't quite fit what we were looking for, or we had to go back and say, hey, no, we actually want this. So a lot of the time was just really pressing the Housing Commission to try and get the information we needed. And then trying to get a handle on what they were saying and talk to residents who've experienced this. And yeah, it was about a year to bring this home. And of course, I was working on other things. It wasn't just a solid year of this, but yeah, it took a lot of time.
I think I'll add just from an editing perspective, talking with Cody throughout this process, you often are in a position where you think the agency should have this data, and then we realize that they don't, and they don't track it, or they don't, as a routine part of their process, match up the tenant data with the landlord rent increase data. So the only real assessment of the rent increase is at the moment of determining whether it's valid or not. And I know that for Cody and I, we were just thinking this is a program in San Diego alone that has the $300 million a year passing through it. And yet we ask for a spreadsheet that's anonymized that shows us exactly how many rent increases are above a certain amount, and we can't get that information. And for us as accountability reporters, I think that says something, and I think it's a lack of access to transparency about how the agency is functioning, and it raises questions about whether they internally have that information. So, yeah.
Okay, well, in lieu of any other questions, I will just kind of first ask our panelists if they have anything else to add before we wrap up.
I would just say that if you have not read this work recently or at all, then please go to our website, inewsource.org, and the toolbar on the top, you will notice featured investigations. hit that, and then it will take you to our featured investigations page, and you will see this whole project. It's the first one in the column, so click on it and you will see all of Cody's great work. There are several stories in there, so enjoy and thank you.
Just very quickly, I want to say thank you to Madeline. She has been so incredibly accessible. There have been many times where I send her a quick email, hey, I just got this response that I don't quite understand. Can you help me break down the legalese behind it? And she has always been so willing. So thank you so much for all of the time you've given me, but also especially for joining us tonight. Thank you.
I feel like it's rare for reporters to actually just keep digging, especially on the data stuff, and you get frustrating responses. So thank you for your awesome reporting. I'm happy to be a resource.
And if you think of something perhaps after the webinar, my email is williamackerman@inewsource.org. Please feel free to email me that information as well. But I think we're just going to go ahead and wrap up here. So without further ado, once again, thank you to all of our panelists and everyone that has attended today. And hope you guys all have a great weekend.